Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I am Adil Brar. Apple is one of the most recognized tech brands in the world with its smartwatches, iPhones, and MacBooks. But there's one country that has really helped Apple propel into the global tech race, and that is China. Patrick McGee, a reporter at the Financial Times, has been covering Apple for many years, and now he's out with a new book called Apple in China. In his book, Patrick argues that Apple's investment in China for nearly a decade helped propel China into the global tech race, reshape its society and its economy. And today, to learn more about how Apple helped China over the years, we are joined by Patrick. Welcome to the show. In your book, you compared Apple's investment in China with the US Marshall Plan. Can you walk us through what that entails and what it means for China's rise in the tech industry?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the programs are similar per se. It's more that Apple, when it was feeling on the back foot in 2015, its relationship with Beijing having deteriorated, it does its own supply chain study internally to try to figure out how much it is investing in the country so that they can basically tout to Beijing and local officials across China, look how much we're doing for the country. So on their own basis, they figure out that they are investing $55 billion a year. That was such an extraordinary figure that I struggled to find any corporate equivalent. So, for instance, if you tally up all Canadian and American private investment into Mexico from the signing of NAFTA in 1993 to 2020, you only get to, I think, around 230 billion. Whereas in May 2016, Tim Cook and his top deputies pledged to invest in China $275 billion over the following 5 years. So in my struggle to find any corporate equivalents, I went to government efforts. And the two things that I really hone in on was Joe Biden's CHIPS Act, which was the flagship plan in America to bring back chip fabrication. That was $52 billion for 4 years. So if you like, Apple was investing a CHIPS Act per year in China. Pretty significant when you think about the Commerce Secretary of America calling that flagship program a once-in-a-generation investment. And then I went towards the Marshall Plan just because it's a massive nation-building effort that most Americans are familiar with through their high school textbooks. I didn't think that the numbers were going to align in any way. I figured that the Marshall Plan was far larger than what Apple was investing, and instead it was actually about half. And that was a 4-year effort versus Apple's 5-year effort. Apple's number is even larger if you consider that they've been investing in China since 2003. The other one I should just mention for the Taipei the audience is that there are figures that come out from your government, and this is in my prologue, so maybe I shouldn't just try to recapitulate it, but I believe the figure over about 30 years was $110 billion. So Apple was just having this extraordinary influence, and I think Taiwan's influence on building China's manufacturing sector is quite well known. I mean, I've got 3 books on the subject on my shelf, and yet we didn't seem to have any real understanding of Apple's influence. So that's where the figure came from in terms of Apple's own study.
Patrick, you've been covering Apple for the Financial Times as a correspondent for a long time. What pushed you to write this book now?
Steve Jobs liked to say that you can only connect the dots backwards when you're looking at your life, trying to make sense of things. And my time at the FT has broadly been divided between reporting from Hong Kong, where I was really beginning to understand China's rise and the first years of Xi Jinping. Then I reported from Germany, where I covered the automotive industry, how things get made, the fragility and the resilience of supply chains. And then I covered Apple for 4 years. I think if you couple those 3 things together, you sort of get the foundation for my book. So that would be my cute answer on that.
And given Taiwan's central role in Apple's supply chain, especially through TSMC, how does Apple navigate its reliance on both China for assembly and Taiwan for semiconductors? And how is that going to really play out since we have cross-strait tensions at the moment?
Well, they're different, aren't they? I mean, Taiwan is a great ally of America, and it doesn't present the same geopolitical risk per se, except for the fact that Xi Jinping seeks to annex Taiwan and has said things like, this is not a problem we will leave to the next generation. So in that sense, it is the same problem in that Apple has enormous exposure to a single country, China, for really all of its manufacturing. And then all of its CPUs really come from TSMC. And so there's a certain sense in which that is the same geopolitical dilemma. One thing I would point out is that Warren Buffett was really bullish on TSMC a few years ago, still says very nice things about the management, but basically divested all of his stock, around $5 billion. And he said, I love the company, I don't like its location. What I find interesting about that is he is also the largest single supporter, the largest single investor of Apple. And yet, over the last 18 months or so, he has divested two-thirds of his investment in Apple. He has not said why, but I think the same logic applies. So I find that very intriguing.
And why did China let Apple develop such a huge footprint inside the country? And what was China's interest in this?
I don't think it's any different why they allowed Terry Guo of Foxconn to set up operations in the country. I mean, China was a pretty poor country following the Cultural Revolution, following the years of Mao, and Deng Xiaoping sets up this whole opening up and reform era, wherein areas like Shenzhen, but most of the rest of the country later on, become like zones open to capitalist experimentation. Tax-free zones that are open for export, and there's a certain sense in which they lure in foreign capital with the explicit goal of learning the expertise so that local Chinese firms and local Chinese people can learn the skills and then thrive on their own. I want to be clear, there's nothing nefarious about that. That's actually pretty brilliant. And it works pretty well for entrepreneurs like Terry Guo or Barry Lam of Quanta. And you could say that's going to work out fine because there's certain reasons why Beijing would never go after Apple, and we can discuss that. But that's quite a gamble when you're talking about an authoritarian regime. Xi Jinping is, I think by his own standard, a dictator for life. I think that's a precarious position for the world's most valuable company to have put itself in.
In your book, I found something really interesting is that there's a company called Inventec, which is a Taiwanese company that took on some of the early contracts to make iPod in Taiwan. And some of this manufacturing was earlier in Japan. What was that initial mix that Taiwan offered that convinced Apple to move some of its supply chains from Japan to Taiwan?
Yeah, so this is in the mid 1990s. And so Japan, for a long time, certainly throughout the 80s, is the go to place. Like all the things you think about China now, that was Japan in the 1980s. But the yen has soared in value, making things more expensive there. And there were labor constraints. There were when you had just-in-time manufacturing in Japan, you actually could see the results in terms of traffic. So it became sort of too successful for its own good in a certain sense. And so what happened is Japanese entrepreneurs began training their former colonies, South Korea and Taiwan, where at some level you actually had a shared language of Japanese, if the Taiwanese in this case were older than 35. And then when the Taiwanese really learn electronics on their own, they form relationships with companies like Apple because Apple is finding it cheaper in Taiwan. What the Apple engineers from the mid 90s would tell me was that Japan was phenomenal if you just wanted to send over a blueprint and someone like Sony or Sharp would take care of it. But they were less good at collaboration. They sort of thought of Apple in a condescending way, like Apple has nothing to teach us. The Taiwanese were sort of in an earlier stage of development in the 1990s relative to Japan. And so they were more eager to learn. And so they would sort of make things more affordable and actually purchase equipment that Apple would need. And so the Newton that people might remember, maybe from textbooks rather than living reality, but the Newton was this sort of like proto iPhone or proto BlackBerry from the mid 1990s. And Inventec is the company that has chosen to do it. And interestingly, it sort of comes full circle. Apple really trains the Inventec engineers how to work with miniature electronics. And 5 or 6 years later, when when Apple gives birth to the iPod, Inventec is the company that they choose because of their experience in miniature electronics.
That's a very fascinating answer. And in your book, you also discuss the issue of censorship that both Apple and China have been trying to deal with for a long time. How do you think the Apple executives have tried to navigate the issue of censorship and data over the years?
I don't know that Apple is actively seeking to address it. Apple doesn't want to spend political capital fighting for the rights of the Chinese to be able to use VPNs, fighting for the rights of the Chinese to rely on the New York Times or get outside the Chinese firewall or use encrypted apps like WhatsApp. Beijing has basically asked for those things and Apple has acceded. Unfortunately, I don't think there is a strong record of Apple sort of fighting for that. not to be too cynical about it, it is quite possible that Apple has fought for those things, but it's behind closed doors. But I certainly did catch a whiff of that. I just want to be a little clear that like it is possible those things have taken place without my knowledge of it. But I don't see much of a track record there.
Tim Cook has personally cultivated ties with Beijing over the years. But now Apple is trying to shift some of its supply chain from China to Vietnam and India. Do you think this strategy is going to work out, or are Apple and China set for a bad breakup?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this is sort of why the story is so live and dynamic right now, because Donald Trump is really the more erratic, unreasonable figure in this regard. So Apple and Xi Jinping, let's say, broadly speaking, they have the same interests. In other words, it works out really well for both parties if Apple is doing all of its manufacturing in China. The sort of new light that I shed on the narrative is just the degree, not just that Apple is dependent on China, but that they are dependent on capabilities they played a major role in creating in China. So, China doesn't offer a whole lot of tech competence in the early 2000s, but for the last quarter century, Apple has been sending literal plane loads of engineers to dozens of factories at first, and then later hundreds of factories to install hundreds of millions of dollars of machinery, and later billions of dollars of machinery to really, like sort of up-arm the electronics industry in China, if you will. That is brilliant for Apple in terms of its margins, its scale, its productivity, and it is brilliant for Beijing because these factories are getting way better because America's best engineers on behalf of Apple are training them. And I think you see the fruit in the pudding, proof in the pudding, with Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, etc., having dominant market share in the smartphones. However, because China has gone in this belligerent, more authoritarian direction where they are threatening a country like Taiwan, that makes it deeply problematic for other actors, right? So in economics, you talk about negative externalities, the parties that are not subject to the relationship, and yet that they are impacted. And so Donald Trump is someone that is really trying to sort of untie the knot that Apple has tied in China. But I don't know that he has enough of an understanding of just how entangled the two parties are, because the idea that they're going to just set up iPhone production shops in Wisconsin or Pittsburgh is downright ludicrous. And so I would advocate that there be major action taking place in India, but Donald Trump has explicitly said he doesn't want that. And Beijing has taken more savvy efforts to actually block the Chinese visas of the people that would need to go over there to set up shop, and also blocked the Chinese-made machinery that India would like to import to rival China. And you can understand why China wouldn't want that to happen. The line I use is that Beijing wants technology transfer to be a one-way gate. The information comes in, it does not leave.
And Patrick, just to summarize, what's at stake for Apple if there's a war in the Taiwan Strait?
I mean, so let's be clear. It's more of a risk to TSMC insofar as someone like Chris Miller, the author of Chip War, has said that TSMC's foundries would stop producing within the first hour of any sort of battle, and they would never be reopened. Apple is TSMC's largest client and has been for more than 10 years. So it's the equivalent of a meteor strike on Apple's business. There is no place else to get TSMC's technology. You're probably better on this than me. I mean, it is absolutely world leading. So if there is a chief benefactor to something like that, it is probably Samsung, which is not only Apple's biggest rival in terms of making smartphones, but it is TSMC's biggest rival, really only rival, in making leading edge node chips. So that's sort of a double whammy on Apple. The only sort of silver lining there is if China were to go to war to try to annex Taiwan, there would be so many things you would be more concerned about than whether you could buy a new iPhone. So I sort of think it would be devastating to Apple, and yet that would not be on my list of concerns.
Thank you for joining us on the show today. It's been great to hear your insights. This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
TaiwanPlus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.